Thank you all for coming and welcome to our pandemic literature panel. I'm Adele Kudish. I'm an associate professor at BMCC. And I think we're just going to proceed in the sort of standard way according to the program. I'll introduce each speaker and then hopefully we'll have a good amount of time at the end for questions. So first we have Rachel Lutwick-Diener, who, although she currently lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Rachel has lived in many places from California to the New York Island. She earned her BA at Colgate University and an MA in English at North Carolina State University. She's in the process of completing an MFA from Queen's University of Charlotte, and she's expected to graduate in May 2023. Her work outside academia is varied. She's a co-host of 2 podcasts, Eat 'em and Weep, in which her sister and she organize competitive cooking shows. And speaking of teaching, a GRCC DLIT podcast, DLIT podcast. Additionally, Rachel writes reviews for Southern Review of Books. She teaches English at Grand Rapids Community College. In her spare time, she enjoys cooking, reading, drinking coffee, and one of my favorite pastimes as well, throwing things out. So thank you, Rachel. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thanks for that great introduction, Adele. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm excited to share this work with everybody. I think that you'll learn as my talk unfolds that my syllabus and global pandemic sort of aligned in ways that I really did not anticipate with, I think, great results. So a question that I grappled with at the beginning of the pandemic was, should professors keep students emotionally and intellectually comfortable in college classrooms? Should we take the temperature of the political climate and adjust the syllabus to keep everyone happy? Current discourse about trigger warnings might suggest that because our students are suffering from the highest rates of mental health issues in generations, they may be best served by avoiding difficult topics of suicide, sexual and physical abuse, death, and other trauma. We've brought in the trauma umbrella to include self-harm, blood, animal cruelty, fat phobia, pregnancy, miscarriage, racism, and hate speech. Given the opportunity to turn away from a topic that could be disturbing, students may choose to opt out. Given the warning, students may internalize that they are too fragile to grapple with such topics, and the ultimate consequence is professors convey that students cannot or should not feel uncomfortable ever. In The Illusion of Safety, The Safety of Illusion, an essay in Roxane Gay's Bad Feminist, the author writes that trigger warnings are so futile, so impotent, and at times belittling. She asks, how dare you presume what I need to be protected from? How dare you? How dare we? And yet there's a culture of fragility on modern college campuses. The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt highlights repeated incidents of college students' refusal to feel uncomfortable and administrators' cautious approach to challenging those refusals. I'm curious about what Gay means when she writes, writers cannot protect their readers for themselves, nor should they be expected to, especially in terms of her use of the word for. As I read this essay, I transpose the word for into from, because trigger warnings give readers the opportunity to escape from the threat of their own memories. Still, a closer reading of the line suggests that readers should be protecting themselves for themselves. Trigger warnings may deny a reader the opportunity to practice that fortitude. No matter what books I put in the syllabus, what discussion questions I craft, how I guide classroom exploration, I cannot protect students from their inner demons, nor should they want me to. The classroom should be a safe place from physical harm and for verbal abuse. It cannot be a safe place from your own mind. We are never going to be safe, and there's nothing like the COVID-19 pandemic to underscore that reality. On top of the more common traumas of living, we have been isolated, at risk of death from a virus we haven't understood very well. Many people were unemployed, uninsured, and unprepared for a world in which human interaction became increasingly rare. In the first weeks of the COVID shutdown, a fellow academic in a Facebook group I follow raised concerns about teaching love in the time of cholera during the pandemic. Many of our colleagues supported this concern. It might be too difficult or triggering for our students to think about death and pandemic. I was curious about the idea that students need protection from discomfort. I've never considered part of my job description to be provisioner of comfort. What about an authentic learning experience is truly comfortable? Isn't opening your mind to different perspectives and frameworks challenging, especially at first? If we wanted our students to feel good about the content of our courses, I don't know how we would ever teach about anything. History, marriage and family, the human body, math. I had planned the following lineup in my 2 literature classes that semester. In LGBTQ Lit, my last unit was the literature of the AIDS crisis, specifically Alan Gerganis's masterful Plays Well with Others, depicting 3 friends during the AIDS epidemic that no one saw coming, and Larry Kramer's play The Normal Heart about the founding of the gay men's health crisis. Additionally, in popular literature, my plan was to complete the semester with Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, in which global pandemic reorders the world. As everyone knows, thanks to the new Hulu or HBO Now show. I decided not to change a single reading. And as it turns out, teaching pandemic literature during a pandemic was invigorating and astounding. Were there students who dropped off when we went online? Yes. However, I didn't find that they dropped off because of the course content. Initially, students questioned my passions in choosing pandemic literature. How did you know, LD? They asked. Of course, I had no idea, I assured them, but the coincidence of having chosen pandemic readings and in both of my classes resulted in a willingness to be vulnerable and an excitement to make connections with our current pandemic. My students read closer and with a keener eye than they had all semester. Perhaps the opportunity to focus on the reading because they had little else to do created a unique end of semester experience. Upon reading Plays Well with Others, my students felt the feels. My student began her Google Hangout conversation with a quote from the text. I arrived just in time to witness the exuberant peasant dance, mid-glade, mid-town. I felt those first fat, playful droplets cool the dancers before lightning struck us with malice aforethought and damn good aim. My student continued, LD, that's what my students call me. This is so scary and so real. I don't know how I'm going to get through this book. Are we just experiencing the first few droplets? Or has the storm not even appeared in the distance? Reading this during another pandemic is so freaking raw. Are these the before days? These authors are just a very safe space to explore my feelings, she wrote, when trying to remain calm in so many areas. The student recognized that literature was a safe space to process as opposed to a triggering danger from which I should protect her. Another student noticed the main character grappling with feelings that mirrored her own. Hartley talked about being becalmed, and boy, oh boy, did I relate. That's how I've been feeling lately, stuck, full of the feeling that I should be moving, but unable to make myself go, waiting for something to happen, trying desperately to fill the days with something worth doing, but unable to find anything that feels productive. An additional student saw our shelter-in-place order as an opportunity to embrace this very disconcerting content. He wrote, now that we're all quarantined, this might be the only time that we can have a glimpse into the uncertainty and the terror surrounding the early days of the AIDS crisis. There were so many of us that weren't there, and I think too many that weren't affected by it personally have forgotten. Maybe they never knew, or maybe it was because it was happening to the queer community, the straight community thought it didn't matter. But coronavirus transfers faster, easier, it's less deadly though. Maybe seeing how impersonal and dispassionate disease is, we can grow a greater amount of empathy. I have to believe that protecting my students from texts like plays well with others would have stripped them of an opportunity to think deeper and make meaning out of a difficult situation for themselves, as Gay says. Now, Gerganus's Plays Well with Others is much more of a reverie on art and friendship than a text about AIDS. It's also written in a prose style that emphasizes playfulness and whimsy over raw details about dying from AIDS, or political imbroglios about controlling the disease spread. I was concerned about moving into the discussion of Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart, as it could be less enjoyable than a literary novel. The most interesting connections my students made outside of the celebration of getting what seemed like a history lesson were the similarities between the current quarantine protests and the efforts to quell the spread of AIDS, HIV through abstinence and more conservative sexual behavior. A line that stood out to many of my students is when one of the founding members of Gay Men's Health Crisis asserts his right to sleep around. Tommy says, "It's my right to kill myself." And Ned says, "But it's not your right to kill me. This is not a civil rights issue. This is a contagion issue." In previous years, this notion of a civil rights issue has not stood out to my students. They focus much more on the intergroup struggles and Ned's trying personality. However, reading the play in the time of coronavirus had my students making interesting connections. One wrote, "When I read this quote, I immediately thought of the protesters in Lansing last week and some of their signs they were holding up. I really like the analogy of drunk driving compared to these pandemics. We have laws and regulations in place to keep people from drunk driving because, one, we don't want innocent people dying from a drunk driver hitting them, but also we don't want the individual person to be injured. Why does the government have these laws in place? Because humans aren't inherently that wise. We repeatedly make poor decisions and don't consider our fellow man." I cannot imagine protecting my students from this. They needed this. They needed the connections and opportunities to parse through the chaos. Similarly, another student wrote, "What is worth noting is that HIV didn't shut down the world. Instead, Dr. Bruckner wanted the gay community to stop having sex. The idea that they would be prohibited from a normal action was anathema to many in Ned's group. And yet here we are with a respiratory disease that's far less deadly with a greater response. Even now, though, in the midst of a disease that has spread easier than faster than HIV, people are chafing at staying home, and there is so much to do." A more cautious professor than I would have reconsidered the choice to teach Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. It's about the end of the world caused by the respiratory virus, the Georgia flu. Some professors would even argue that my decision to teach this book in popular literature class outside of pandemic times, given that Mandel's text is arguably more literary than some of the other sci-fi action hero texts we examine throughout the semester. And yet I've never been able to resist including Mandel's book in a popular literature course. It has the commercial success, but it's also a good book. My students crave good books more than they crave easy or comfortable reads. One student highlighted the passage, "In those first days, it was still inconceivable that civilization might not come back from this at all." He went on to write, "Who hasn't had a thought like this at some point, if not many points over the past several weeks? It's not that hard to imagine someone looking back 5 or 10 years from now and thinking about all our own time. If the civilization that we know ever collapses, it seems likely that in the fog of war, we wouldn't understand that it was truly collapsing or would be in denial. I admire how my student considers that this might be us, refusing to acknowledge the epic shift we're all experiencing. It's true that 2 months into quarantine and many months into global pandemic, we still expect to go back to our busy lives. My student sees that we might not see it, just as the civilization in the book couldn't see it either." Another student's close reading of the text focuses in on the very real concern about physical safety beyond infection. To consider that people are arming themselves, collecting arsenals is terrifying, and yet she allows herself to consider why. The text creates a place to make connections and consider the perils of our current world. She writes, "The usage of guns in this book reminds me of how people are preparing themselves for the pandemic how many people purchase more guns now than ever. Some shops even ran out of guns. I think some people are paranoid that this virus might get worse and fear for their safety if the government gets out of hand. Returning to the concerns of the original Facebook post, it would be easy to second guess how any of our students would react to a text that depicts a harrowing situation too close to our current world. To decide on my students' behalf that reading about pandemic during a pandemic might be too stressful or triggering is to deprive them of the opportunity to feel, to think, to process within the framework of a class, where there are other students experiencing the same exact thing at the same exact time. What could be safer than to do this together? Ultimately, do I feel conflicted about trigger warnings, as does Roxanne Gay? Yes. Do I use them? Yes. This book is about rape and abuse, I say. This book is about suicide. This book is about domestic abuse. And now I'll say, this book is about pandemic. Have there been situations when even trigger warned students ask for an alternative? Yes, for sure. I've had times when students told me I tried to read the bell jar in the past, but the second half was too much for me. I always say there are workarounds, and sometimes we use them and sometimes we don't. When I assigned Push by Sapphire, several students were vocal about the depictions of abuse as too much. I advised which pages to skip, and we were still able to have a discussion about poverty, inner city living, race, HIV/AIDS, and literacy. In those cases, the students tell me they were advocates for themselves, protect themselves. Me, decide for them what they can handle, tell them that they're fragile, or make a decision for them. Now, that would be the end of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I'm sorry, I actually didn't say the title of your paper before. That was Everybody Panic, Teaching Pandemic Literature During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Thank you again. Next, we have Steve Essling. Steve is an adjunct professor currently working for the University of Winnipeg, Manitoba. His research deals with the intersection of eco-criticism and genre fiction in the 19th century, including apocalyptic literature and the eco-Gothic. His recent work has appeared in Gender and Environment in Science Fiction, the Journal for the Study of British Cultures and Science Fiction Studies. He's currently working on a monograph on the origins of disaster fiction in the 19th century, and his paper is entitled Teaching Defoe Before and During COVID-19, a case study in the pedagogy of plague literature.
Sorry, I am just going to bring my slides up.
Take your time.
Oh, there we go. All right. Okay. Just gonna start myself a timer to make sure that I stay within my allotted time here. As my students have frequently pointed out, I have a tendency to go over. So a little bit of background. So as the bio said, I am someone who works a lot with disaster, with apocalypse. So I am a catastrophist. And a lot of times when I am given, right, the option to tailor a class to my interest, the result will be a fair bit of apocalyptic literature. And as I do enjoy being topical, the result of this was over the course of the pandemic that I, in fact, deliberately sought to teach pandemic literature to many of my students. Of course, they knew when they were taking a class with me that it was, entitled apocalyptic literature, that we would be encountering this sort of material. And of course, there is the generalized trigger warning at the beginning of the class that, apocalyptic fiction will contain a great deal of potentially triggering things up to and including the extinction of the human race. So I taught as a 19th century scholar a few works of much older pandemic literature, including Mary Shelley's The Last Man, in which a plague wipes out all human beings save the protagonist. Of course, Poe's Masque of the Red Death, which the students enjoyed greatly, regardless of circumstances. And while 19th century literature for my intro level course that was themed to crisis and collapse, because again, catastrophist. I had always included passages from Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. So, oh, I'm not screen sharing. There you go. My apologies. So Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, if I don't know how many people are familiar with it. One of the curious things presented about it, because Defoe comes in so early in the sort of history of the novel, right? Older forms of the canon have often cited Defoe as being the first English novelist in terms of writing Robinson Crusoe. Obviously, this ignored several female novelists before him, and now we no longer use that term. But nonetheless, he's coming in so early in the history of the novel here that Journal of the Plague Year is difficult to interpret from a novelistic perspective. He himself presented it as observations and memories of public and private occurrences that take place in London during the outbreak of the Great Plague in 1665. And that perception of the text as being both fictional and not is one of the things that I noticed distinctly varied over the course of teaching this text, because I began this class in the fall of 2019. And so the first time I taught this text with my intro level students, nobody had heard of COVID-19. It had not yet sort of emerged on the public radar. And even in the winter term, right, we knew that it was something that was happening elsewhere and had not yet sort of swamped in Canada. Then over the next year, I continued teaching this class remotely, and because we were deep in the pandemic. So I wanted to talk about my experiences, what I noticed in the variations between teaching this particular piece of plague literature prior to and then during pandemic circumstances. So quickly speaking here, right, if anybody is familiar with these particular historical circumstances, Defoe here is talking about the Great Plague of London, which takes place 1665, 1666, which devastates about a quarter of the city. And then gets topped off with the Great Fire of London the following year. And so he is writing about very apocalyptic circumstances. But unlike the suggestion at the beginning of the text here, right, that this is based off observations of memories of these particular events, I tell the students Defoe himself is 5 years old at the time when all of this is happening. And from our best sort of evidence, he is shipped off to the countryside, as is the case with most middle-class children, people in vulnerable positions at this point in time. The city empties, and Defoe is part of this wave. So he himself has not, right, directly observed these events. Instead, Defoe claims to have discovered and then novelized the journal of his uncle, Henry Foe, who was a saddler, just as the protagonist of Journal of the Plague Year is. Because the work is is presented as a memorial, as a diary, and because it is so thorough in its historical research, the book was received as a work of nonfiction, and arguments to the effect that it is a work of nonfiction continue well into the 19th century until historiographic work comes to a different conclusion that, in fact, this should best be seen as a work of historical fiction. We have never discovered the journal that Defoe claims to have used as inspiration for this, but of course, right, that could easily have succumbed to the passage of time. So later historiographers of the novel, as I mentioned, now consider it a well-researched work of imaginative fiction, and note, right, the emphasis on emotion and storytelling that is part of the text. So the narrative alternates between a memoir of the narrator's time in London and what he witnesses there, providing both a history of the plague and of the city during plague, supported by facts and figures. And this is one of the ways in which students responded very differently to the text between pandemic and post-pandemic circumstances. So for instance, this is a passage from Journal of the Plague Year that shows you Defoe's emphasis on historiographic values, right? Providing the number of mortalities, the burials, finding out that the plague is spreading by comparing the number of burials from one place to another in terms of the history of burials in this particular part of the city. And the narrative is also interspaced with official documents, such as these orders conceived and published by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London concerning the infection of the plague, which issues the quarantine orders that come to dominate London, and which students reading this initially have little interest in 17th century document officials, but which took on a particular new relevance, right, when we are teaching pandemic literature during COVID-19, and they see, oh, look, this is, right, the same sort of governmental style of text as all of those COVID briefings that we used to get here, right, in Canada, the Prime Minister talking from his cottage, or health officials holding their press conferences. So to make the comparison then, student responses to the text before the pandemic tended to focus very strongly on the documentary aspects of the text. So very much concerned, right, with the way that Defoe created this illusion of having actually been there, of having witnessed all these things. In other words, they responded to it much like the first readers of Journal of the Plague Year did, by treating it as a work of historical fiction. And discussing the historical circumstances of the plague was something that was very remote to them. Most of them had no such experiences to relate to, and a great number of them mentioned that this was one of the more alienating texts on account of its remoteness on the syllabus, though not beating Tennyson's The Fall of Arthur. I use this text to introduce these intro level students, first year students, to the ideas of sympathy, empathy, and antipathy in literary studies. And once introduced to these concepts, students are generally able to identify instances of sympathy and empathy, but struggled with the idea of antipathy, and particularly struggled with the idea that you could have a nuanced approach to a text like this in which sympathy and antipathy existed. So characters, for instance, who broke quarantine, even though they were potentially infected, seemed, right, straightforwardly evil to these students who were working prior to the pandemic. They simply reacted with antipathy to them. My own approach, what pedagogical guidance I provided on the text before the pandemic, included the standard historical, biographical, and narratological context that I was talking about momentarily. And my emphasis here really lay in encouraging the students to reflect on the contrast between that documentary nature of a lot of the text and the anecdotes and other form of storytelling that is present in this narrative. So for instance, Defoe telling a story about how he once hears about a mother who loses her daughter, and he goes on at length to describe the process of her grief upon discovering that her daughter has perished from the plague, that she faints and then runs all over the house and screams and cries, and perishes within a few hours afterwards from her grief. And of course, all of these anecdotes and comments in the narrative, right, are caveated with claims like, it is so long ago that I am not certain, but I think the mother never recovered and died 2-3 weeks later. So highlighting, right, the fictional aspects of this. And that's something I had to point out to the students in terms of making that distinction between the real and the fictional. The goal of the exercise was to get students to understand that Defoe sought to humanize a historical event by providing these specific pathos-laden examples of human suffering along with the detached historical data. So understanding that simply presenting something like this doesn't communicate the emotional experience of the pandemic. And as I mentioned before, I took this opportunity to define sympathy, empathy, and antipathy for them. After, or rather I should say, because we're still not after the pandemic, during the pandemic, I found the student responses shifted considerably here. Students were now able to very readily recognize the circumstances of the narrator and the other characters in the narrative, and would know with surprise and no small degree of cynicism, the similarities in human responses to plague and to quarantine. And so the sort of defiances, the tendency to gravitate towards quack medicines, and of course, the sort of paranoia and isolation that comes with even self-imposed quarantine. Students reading Journal of the Plague Year during the pandemic wanted to focus a lot more on the fictional aspects of the text. In which we could read about the experience of the individuals seeking to or fleeing the plague. And so this kind of data, which was very straightforward to pre-pandemic students, right? Oh, I'm just looking at a documentary, was much less interesting to the students during the pandemic than those anecdotes that I was talking about more a moment ago. The students were able to more easily relate to the characters, and yes, indeed, some of the students did find the concept upsetting in as much as it did remind them of the current crisis. And in terms of that opportunity to talk about sympathy, empathy, and antipathy, so the same ability to identify sympathy and antipathy, but a much greater nuance when it comes to identifying moments in which sympathy and antipathy are mixed. So they were able, right, having been in this position, to feel a lot more sympathetic towards those characters that pre-pandemic students were purely antipathetic towards. And they were also much more readily able to identify antipathy in the author's critique of the disproportionate role of wealth during the pandemic, because that is something that they themselves had identified. So for instance, I would present them with this passage in which Defoe critiques the court. I should observe that the court was removed early in the month of June and went to Oxford, where it pleased God to preserve them, and that the distemper did not, as I heard of, so much as touch them, for which I cannot say that I ever saw they showed any great token of thankfulness, and hardly anything of reformation, though they did not want being told that their crying vices might without breach of charity said to have been gone far in bringing that terrible judgment upon the whole nation. Pre-pandemic students struggled with this passage, in part, right, because of the ironizing tone of Defoe here. Students during the pandemic did not have this problem, but readily identified, right, this critique of the rich and powerful, who are more easily able to subtract themselves from the consequences of pandemic. And so my own pedagogical guidance on the text had to shift as I was teaching this text. That rather than ensuring comprehension of the historical circumstances here, my task as the instructor became more focused on negotiating affect, both explicating affect in the text, but also negotiating the students' own visceral responses of shock, anger, and sadness as they encountered the text. So my methodology here was to try to provide them with forums to express this reaction. The asocial nature of remote teaching made this a little bit difficult during classes themselves. The one time that I did teach this text in person during the pandemic, there was a brief term in which the University of Winnipeg decided, hey, this pandemic is going away, let's go back into in-person teaching, and then very quickly changed their mind the next term. Students were a lot more willing to sort of take this opportunity to ruminate, which is the nice way of saying having a bitch sess, about the pandemic circumstances in quarantine and all of these other things. But over remote teaching, it was very difficult to get students to express themselves. I instituted online discussion forums as an aid or replacement to classroom discussion with mixed results. Participation usually came from the strongest students, and those students felt that they needed to strive for academic dispassion in a graded exercise. And so it was actually the sort of weaker students who participated at a lower rate who were more willing to talk about their own feelings. And that's something that I have noted for future classes. The best outlet, oh, sorry, I'm almost at time here, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up. The best outlet I found, I included a personal reflection at the end of term in which these students could talk about their own emotional response to a text, right, beyond the usual like academic um, conditions of essay writing, since essay writing was one of the goals of this of this class, pardon me. Obviously, the students responding to Journal of the Plague Year distinctly increased during the pandemic. Students reported that the text made them feel less aberrant in their experiences. So it made them feel seen. It made them feel more comfortable to realize that even 4 centuries ago, people were experiencing the same things. In their class evaluations, they reported that it provided them a vocabulary with which to express those experiences. The document was useful to them. So my conclusion from having taught this text before and during the pandemic is that the students' greatest interest lies in the way that the author and the characters narrative their experience of living during a plague as a means of enabling them to narrativize their own experience of the pandemic, either to one another or through the more official function of that personal reflection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you for timing yourself as well. We want to have time for discussion. And our third speaker is Catherine Turley-Sohn. Catherine has a PhD in humanities with an emphasis in museum studies, a master's degree in literature, and a bachelor's degree in English and composition and rhetoric. She teaches a variety of honors and regular English and interdisciplinary studies courses at Cypress College in Cypress, California, where she's a full professor. Catherine is also the director of the Campus Honors Program and the Service Learning Center, a Puente faculty, study abroad faculty, and an assistant curator at the Campus Art Gallery. And Catherine's paper is entitled Pandemic Writing from the Embalmer's Gaze.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well and can get started. Okay, I just wanted to just start with focusing on this a particular course that I teach as one of my responsibilities at Cypress College. We have an unusual program on our campus in mortuary science, and the community colleges in California about 5 years ago, the state asked colleges to propose baccalaureate programs. They needed to expand and to offer 4-year programs at a lot of the community colleges and to meet student needs. And we had a 2-year program in mortuary science that was at Cypress College. And so they decided to propose a 4-year baccalaureate program, as there were essentially not any 4-year programs west of the Mississippi. So there was a big need in general in the western part of the country to address sort of that need. They did so, and as part of that program, they needed curriculum in advanced writing. And so they asked me to write the curriculum for the advanced writing for the health sciences and mortuary science course. And so that's when I very first started teaching this class about 5 years ago. And I have to say it's become probably my favorite class that I teach. And for a variety of reasons. And it was so different from anything I had done previously. So that's always fun and challenging. But the students are absolutely fascinating. And I have just really been amazed and learned so much from them. And so it's been a great experience. These students are primarily already embedded in their industry. Many of them completed the 2-year program years ago, or were in the process of that, and were well into their career. And when the 4-year opportunity that was local became available, many of them came back because they really wanted a bachelor's degree. And so we have a lot of those students who are well on their way into the program. They really do a lot of emphasis on research that's very specific to and topical to what they're doing in their industry. And a lot of the writings that we focus on include writing papers for industry journals. And they do a lot of public policy work and try to work with the state on policy in the industry. They also work on a lot of industry documents as well. And so that's the type of writing that they were doing. For me, as the English professor coming in, I really wanted to pull some literature that would be topical for them and sort of take them in a different direction than all their other courses were doing. And so that was fun to start looking at that. Some of the things that I began to do was incorporate a lot of literature that focused on death. And so over the semesters, these are just a variety of some of the things that I have looked at. They range from Hamlet to looking at memoirs, which would be like the Joyce Carol Oates one, or the C.S. Lewis, or the Joan Didion, or the Simone de Beauvoir. Those all were sort of memoir type pieces. We've also gone the way of some satirical novels. The Evelyn Waugh one, The Loved One, is a sort of infamous one that takes on a very satirical look at what's going on with the funeral industry, specifically in California. Whereas the one, let's see, The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford looks at the funeral industry similarly in a satirical way, but covers the whole country and does a little bit of international as well. More recently, Thomas Lynch put out a group of essays called The Depositions, which have been very interesting, as Thomas Lynch is not only a writer, but he's also a funeral director. So he incorporates a lot of personal experience into that essay collection, which has been fun. And then finally, the one at the bottom, there's Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and Other Lessons from the Crematory, is an interesting piece by Caitlin Doty. She's had a couple of New York Times bestsellers. She does TED Talks. She's got a blog called Ask the Mortician. And she was a graduate of the 2-year program from Cyprus. So it was really nice to be able to have her voice in the classroom and have her as a guest speaker as well. And we also would look at art and film. One show that we have used a lot is the HBO series. I don't know if any of you saw it in the early 2000s. 6 Feet Under was one of the early HBO pieces. Takes place in Pasadena, California. And many of the faculty in the mortuary science program and the students from Cypress College all served as interns and advisors on the TV show. And so that's sort of a fun historical piece that's a lot of fun for them to look at and experience. But that was all sort of pre-pandemic things. We were really addressing the topics of death and going deep on that and giving them an opportunity to look at death from a different perspective, from a literary perspective at any rate. So when we went into transition here, we obviously started looking not as plague as a metaphor, but really plague as actuality and reality. And particularly in these students' lives, it was very intense. They went from, Zoom classes to conducting Zoom funerals, and from doing drive-through textbook pickups to drive-through viewings at their work sites. They were used to wearing PPE in the embalming labs at their workplaces, but now they were wearing their PPE in the classroom. And so these were just really very powerful shifts and transitions that they were having to make very quickly. And so we were, trying to address those things in the classroom as well. And so I began making a shift in the kinds of literature that we would be using. And we went to, again, looking at the Defoe pieces of that text, The Plague, Camus' The Plague, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, really like 100 Years of Solitude. We did a little bit in Time of Cholera, but I prefer his other one. We have Atwood's text, and even looking at Colson Whitehead's Zone 1, which was, this sort of apocalyptic zombie sort of novel that has been really interesting over the last 4 semesters to kind of plug these in and out. But truly the one I think that has worked the best for us is looking at the Decameron, Boccaccio's piece on a group of people that many of you already are familiar with it, that get together and tell stories and quarantine together in a house in Italy. And it was just worked so nicely with the Decameron Project, Stories from Quarantine, that the New York Times Magazine had been publishing these stories, and they put together the text and published, I think it was late 2020, that they actually put together a book with all those stories, and being able to compare and contrast those ones and have the discussion of really the current stories of the quarantine with some really age-old famous ones as well was really a good place to go. We, of course, had to do a lot of transactional work in this process as well. And as colleagues have mentioned all day, you know, trying to deal with mental health considerations truly became critical. And you know, like the earlier presentation, I think that you know, you're talking about triggers and things. You know, there was not even time for triggers in this one, because they were doing triggering events that they were experiencing every day when they would leave the classroom. And so I tried to, you know, open up, you know, wellness options, campus health resources, but it also began more of a discussion of these topics in class than we had ever even considered talking about before. And so there was a definite shift there. We also, you know, began reading really reality rather than fiction, you know, spending time in those New York Times Magazine articles and looking at real experiences of plague. And writing as therapy sort of became a different sort of take on the class than had been happening previously. They went for research writing and doing, you know, a lot of really public policy, legalistic kind of writing, to I began opening it up to really doing dialectical journals with a personal take, you know, and letting them incorporate some of their experiences and comparing them to some of the literature and things that we were working with. For the first time ever, I offered them an opportunity. They could do a research piece on a topic that they were really interested in the industry, or they could write poetry, write a short story, do a personal essay. And I was stunned that both last fall and this spring, every student has chosen to do something in the creative realm. And they've been absolutely stunning pieces that have come through that are just, you know, so personal, but so clear and so interesting that I don't want to take those pieces out as I move forward. I think that it's become just really an important piece of the course. And we had to learn how to connect and support in a digital way as well. And as we were doing peer editing of papers and things in the past, and that was always an important sort of piece, and they would work together on projects, the students started, they would record their Zoom funerals that they were conducting, and they would bring those to class, and they would let each other edit and help and say, well, why don't you try this? Well, have you thought about managing it this way? And so all of a sudden we had all these new material for students to collaborate with and to help edit and to help work on transacting these changes that were so critical in their particular industry. And we started talking a lot about equity gaps in the death industry, and who was being served first and who was being made to wait. And while these students had huge refrigerated trucks sitting outside of their workplace, you know, how were these bodies prioritized? And how could they be really cautious and careful about how those equity gaps were becoming really apparent? And so, so that became really an important discussion that we continued to have with the class. We also, at this time, sort of really did make a shift to looking at a lot of journalism. We began looking a lot at the sort of stuff that was currently going on every day. And students were picking out articles. I was finding ones. Of course, the New York Times had many articles from, you know, how do you maintain dignity for the dead in the pandemic? Overwhelmed by bodies, funeral homes are struggling to fulfill their mission to grieving families. This was stuff that was so real to my students. You know, the future of funerals. Thinking about, there was one that Huffington posted on a Texas embalmer that was absolutely horrifying. The New Yorker did the body collectors of the coronavirus pandemic and really focused on a lot of people in the industry. So those became really excellent resources for us to process, but also to continue this critical thinking discussion and looking at it carefully, and how were people presenting it, and how could they do it better, or what are they not covering, what are they leaving out of the story. So it opened up a lot of those kinds of discussions. And a new assignment that I plugged in is to have these students submit stories to the campus newspaper as well as to the local newspapers about their own personal experiences in the industry during this very difficult time. And that became we got to work with the journalism department, got to have, their editor come in and work with the students. And a lot of those things ended up being part of their wellness during this time, and part of the therapy of the topic and the writing assignments, and how those kinds of things might help with them. And at the same time, which was so critical to the class and completing the objectives, is how do we make sure their writing's improving? Are they becoming, better critical thinkers, writers, and readers through this process? And how can we shift what they're reading, what they're studying, and what they're writing about in order to make sure that those things are still taking place? Let's see. And so we're at that point of what now? How is this changing? One of the things that with sort of my arts background, wayfinding theory became really, really helpful. And we're using that more and more in the class. And but looking at wayfinding in sort of a different take from how do you make your way around a museum to, how do you navigate this new space that these students are not just only academically in, but what they are doing in their profession, and how can they sort of think about navigating that in a theoretical perspective. And that's become a really great discussion. And, the other piece to wayfinding is that, is there a route to the destination you want to get to? Does that exist? And answering that question. And as they look forward to, how are we running funerals? How are we doing this? Is there, a destination here? Or do we need to do some wayfinding, adjusting through that, some design thinking sort of applications in this project? And then for them to really be thinking and evaluating, what was the navigator's experience for them? How did they navigate this journey? How can they flesh that out and look at it in a very real way, as well as in a metaphorical way? And also, how can they apply that navigator's experience to their clients? And how is the navigating experience working for their clients as well? And so I think wayfinding is going to be permanently take a space in this class. That's worked really well. And we've spent a lot more time talking about ethical burials and things like that. And what are the ethics of death and burial and all those processes. And many of them are moving forward to doing rewriting in industry standards. Many things have changed. In California, it was fall of 2020, they had to shut down crematoriums for 2 weeks in Los Angeles because the air quality was so terrible. And so, I mean, there's, so they're starting to look at, how do we get away from what's another friendly way to cremation? Because that didn't, when we were in this pandemic stage, they had to stop cremating people. And they couldn't keep up with burials, and it's expensive. And so the economics of that became really interesting and terrifying and horrifying, but something that needed to be addressed. And so those are topics that they're sort of really focusing on as we move forward. But again, it's certainly been a time of change. And these students have experienced it in one of the most striking, real, and to the heart kinds of ways. And, they'd bring their pictures of things, signs they're putting up in their funeral homes and things to share. And it's just not ever going to look the same again. But it has really been a great experience to incorporate different kinds of literature and storytelling and different kinds of assignments to bear on this sort of critical thinking objectives that are required in the class. And so again, it's still my favorite class. So Thank you. I'll stop screen sharing, and I think I went about a minute and a half over, so apologies.
That's perfectly okay. Thank you so much, Catherine. Just wanted to point out in the chat that Jessica pointed out that Antigone is a great work to teach on ethical burials. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. So we can open it up to discussion, questions. I have a few, but I want to let some of my colleagues and the participants, maybe I'll ask a question while you reflect and come up with other questions. So this is something that I've been thinking about anyway. And Steve, you brought this up, and I thought maybe all of you want to weigh in on it. But it's the question of academic dispassion, right? I think that there's starting to be some sort of change or evolution in this notion that we shouldn't engage personally or emotionally with what we read as academics, and how do we how do we address that in the classroom? I've certainly been evolving in my opinions on it from when I first started teaching many years ago. So I was wondering if you wanted to, Steve, if you wanted to say more about that, or if anybody else wanted to comment on this issue that's more of a bigger academic issue.
Yeah, my experience of it has been, because these were a lot of first year classes, right? And I have to teach them to be ready for their upper year classes, often taught by somewhat more traditional professors who will, reject the idea of somebody using I in an essay. That I do try, in my more formal portions of the class to teach them proper essay writing, the academic eye, ensuring that your, thesis statements are not subjective, and all of this. But I also wanted, especially during the pandemic, to provide them with outlets for their other responses to texts, aesthetic, emotional, subjective, and so forth, which is not as valued in academic writing. So I guess my solution was to create a couple of divergent paths in the classroom by having both the official essayist path, but also providing the discussion forums and that personal reflection, which I have actively encouraged more subjective responses to, whilst trying to still ensure that distinction so that they don't get confused about what mode of writing is which.
I agree, Steve. I think that that whole, the last 10 years particularly, we're seeing that go away so much more. And I think that the less traditional writing is becoming more and more accepted, and the use of I and personal experience, of course, setting it up with all of the, academic research and backing things up is important, but it's so much more accepted across the board that my training was not to do that. And so it's been a shift to open up to that. But I think it's important, and experiences like this emphasize how important that is.
I mean, most of my students are not going on to be English majors. And so my classes, as long as, there's some synchronous element, are really discussion based. And I sort of feel like my job is to just kind of like bring it back to the text every once in a while, but there's not a lot of dispassion when we're talking about the books. I just want to see enthusiasm, and often we start with a passage that they've selected, and then they just go from there.
I had a question, Adele, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Manya. Thank you.
Catherine, do students who are not mortuary science students take the class ever? Do you have like an English major who's just interested in that class? It sounds like such a great class. I don't know. I think you got at least I know you got more than my interest, but you know, definitely got my interest. When we were reading your proposal, we were just like fascinated, like what a great, how interesting, you know? So do you?
That's right. No, we do
Oh,
not.
interesting.
It's strictly only for students in that program because I'm at a community college, so it's all 2-year, and this is a 300 level class.
Okay.
And that's the only 4-year program on our campus. But starting next year, there are another 14 4-year programs in the state of California. And some of them are, struggling with filling their advanced writing classes. And so we're going to move students from other 4-year programs that are in health sciences area will be joining us. So the audience is going to expand a little bit. They will still be in that health sciences umbrella, but I think it will typically just stay majority of these students.
Are there other questions from the audience or from the participants? Oh, Steffi, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it's a question so much as just a comment that I think it's always this really interesting question, you know, when we talk about trauma and triggers and dealing with you know, the current crisis, to what extent it's, you know, it's more triggering or traumatizing to read about it, and to what extent I think many of us, I had a colleague a number of years ago who said, like, academics' response to trauma is research, right? As soon as something terrible happens to you, you immediately want to start reading about it. And that's, like, for us, I think, comforting. And, you know, maybe, and actually that helps us be dispassionate about it, because, like, oh my God, something terrible is happening to me. I need to read about it happening to other people. You know, so we're sort of pushed in two directions. One is it can, you know, push students over the edge to read about something that's too much like their own traumatic experience. But on the other hand, it might be precisely what they need, right? That sense of being seen, right? That sense of, oh, I can relate to this. This is happening to me. So it's just sort of interesting. I don't have a conclusion. And I know that at the beginning of the pandemic, in my composition classes, which went online, I decided to get rid of what was supposed to be our research project and said, instead, I want you to write about the pandemic. But I then was afraid, oh my God, maybe I'm traumatizing them. So I surveyed them first. A few of them said, you know, I said, is this too much for you to deal with? And like one or two said, well, it could be too much for some people, but nobody ever said, like, it's too much for me. And most of them said, yeah, this is all we can think about anyway, so let's write about this. And it turned out it went well, but, like, that's always the question.
Yeah, great question. And I struggled with that too. And can I really take this whole research piece out of the class, you know, but I kept it in there as an option. And I too was really it's a little surprised, though, that they all chose to go with the creative writing pieces instead, and really did amazing work. And, you know, and obviously we can still accomplish all of those objectives of the course in the creative writing pieces, but just so untypical to what the traditional course looks like. And so for me, it opened my eyes up to looking at that differently in all my classes, not just in this one where it was so pertinent and it was so powerful and it was so immediate for all of these students. But yeah, no, they needed to talk about it and they needed to write about it, and the research and all those things, I think, were really beneficial.
Ultimately, the tendency, right, to talk about the students as though they are a monolithic block who all have similar needs is always going to lead us astray, because you know, they are individuals and will respond to texts and crises and questions like this individually. So yeah, some of them will find that reading pandemic literature gives them the vocabulary, as some of them said in their reader responses. And for others, it's just another version of doom scrolling and is bad for their mental health. And so I think the best way to approach it is to provide the students with options, even if none of them take that option, that at least they know, right, that the ability is there. So for instance, my class on catastrophic fiction, you know, if one of these texts is too much for you, You don't have to use it on any of your written papers because I always provide the opportunity to write about whichever text you preferred. So, it's good to have the class built with that sort of flexibility that they can self-guide themselves away from any traumatic topics if that should arise.
Steve, are you familiar with Severance by Ling Ma? It came out in 2019. Does anyone know that novel?
Is it the one that has recently been adapted into the ITV? No. Okay.
No. It's same title, different idea, but it is a pandemic that turns people into monsters, and there's sort of like a cult element, and it feels like a little more modern than Station 11, but man, it's great. And I'm teaching it in Poplet this summer. I'm really excited.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. I admit that I spent so much time in the 19th century that I am not always up to date on the most recent examples of the genre.
I love, Rachel, that you teach a pop lit class. That is so cool. We don't have one. We should.
You
we should
know,
offer that.
It's like I'm sure it's a little different because you're in a much bigger system, like, but we can only teach what's like gonna transfer, to our transfer institutions, and somehow Poplit transfers. It's a gen ed, so we get like a ton of students taking it, and we've taught over the years. I've taught like Harry Potter, Hunger Games. I did a lot of Station 11. I've done a lot of graphic novels. It's a blast. It's really a blast. This summer, we're doing it with a monster theme. So we have like Frankenstein, the YA graphic novel, A Monster Calls. We're doing Severance, the Nickel Boys, Close and Whitehead. So, I mean, I'm really pumped.
That sounds great. I want to take it.
Come on over.
Can I audit?
Yeah, there's only 4 people enrolled, so there's room for you now.
Oh, okay, cool. Is it in person? Oh, well, that was my other, I mean, we only have like 2 minutes, but we were talking, thanks, Manya. We were talking a little bit before the session started about the future, right? So like, we've talked about the past before pandemic and during pandemic, and are some of you teaching in person? Yeah.
I'm teaching all hybrid this semester, so I meet everybody for like 1 90-minute session a week, but next semester we're going back to more in person.
Yeah, my campus is still closed to any in person. So
wow, that must be one of the last holdouts.
I think a lot of California community colleges are just maybe 20% on campus at the most. So I think this fall there'll be a big shift, but we're still, even for fall, looking at like 50-50, I think.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Yeah. Well, there's a new wave now. I had it 10 days ago. A lot of people I know had it. So, as vaccinated as I am, it's still.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so I'm glad I'm not
absolutely.
teaching in person. I would have missed out really a week and a half.
Yeah.
Oh, we got to go. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. It was
pleasure.
fun.
These
Nice
papers
meeting you.
fit really well together too. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.